There is a boy standing in the doorway of a hall in southern England. It is sometime in the 850s. The fire behind him is low. The wind outside smells of wet earth and smoke. He is small, pale, and quiet, the youngest of 5 sons in a family that carries the weight of a kingdom on its shoulders. And almost nobody in the room pays him any attention at all. That is the first thing you have to understand about Alfred. Before the books were written about him, before the statues were raised to him, before the name the Great was ever attached to any English king, because it had never been attached to one before, this was who Alfred was: a younger son, a spare, a quiet child in a loud world. A boy who was not expected to rule, not groomed to rule, not prepared to rule in the way his older brothers were. A boy whose entire early life was shaped by the simple, invisible fact that the crown of Wessex was meant for other heads. And yet, one day, history would set that crown on his. How he got from that doorway to that crown is not the story most people tell. Most people tell the story of the warrior, the man who stood against the Vikings when the other kingdoms of England had already fallen, the man who hid in the marshes, the man who burned the cakes. If the old legend is to be believed, the man who rebuilt a shattered people and left behind a legal code, a navy, a revival of learning, and a dynasty that would one day call itself English. That is a real story, but it is not the story we are walking into tonight. Tonight, we are walking into the life that came before all of that. The quiet life, the unseen life, the decades almost nobody talks about, because they are decades in which Alfred was not yet anyone in particular, a small boy, a travelling child, a young man at court, a younger brother riding beside older brothers who were expected to live and to rule and who, one by one, did not. This is the story of the unlikely prince everyone ignored. And if you want to understand how a man becomes a legend, you have to begin where no legend exists yet. You have to begin in the ordinary, in the cold mornings of a royal household in a small kingdom on the edge of Christendom, in the company of a mother who taught him to love the sound of words, in the echo of a church in Rome, in the long shadow of 4 older brothers, in the first distant rumour of the dragon ships on the horizon. You have to begin where Alfred began. As a boy, nobody was watching. He was born, as far as we can tell, around the year 849 in a place called Wantage, in what is today Oxfordshire, but was then deep inside the kingdom of Wessex. Wessex was one of several English kingdoms in the British Isles at that moment, and by the standards of the ancient world it was not grand. It was not Rome. It was not Constantinople. It was a patchwork of fields, forests, hill forts, wooden halls, stone churches, Roman ruins quietly being reclaimed by moss, and small towns that by our standards would barely count as villages. His father was Ethelwulf, king of the West Saxons. His mother was Osburh, a noblewoman of whom the records tell us very little, except for one extraordinary detail that we will come back to, because it reveals more about Alfred than almost anything else in his childhood. Ethelwulf already had 4 sons when Alfred was born. Ethelstan, the eldest, already a grown man. Ethelbald, Ethelbert, Ethelred. 4 brothers in a line, each one older than the small boy who had just arrived, and in the world of 9th century Wessex, that line was everything, because the crown did not pass automatically from father to eldest son. It passed through a council, a choosing, an idea called the Witan, in which the leading men of the kingdom gathered and confirmed the next king. But in practice, the crown tended to move along a clear path. It moved through the grown men of the royal house, it moved through the proven warriors, it moved through the brothers who had already fought, already ridden, already been seen. Alfred, at the end of that line, was almost invisible. He was the youngest of 5. He was small, He was, by the accounts that come down to us, often unwell, and he was so far from the throne that it would have been considered absurd, almost impolite, to imagine him on it. There were simply too many lives between his and the crown, too many brothers, too many healthy, able, older men to understand what that actually meant for a small boy. You have to step away from the modern idea of royalty. Alfred was not raised in a palace. Palaces, as we imagine them, did not exist in 9th century England. He was raised in halls. Long wooden halls with high beamed ceilings, thatched roofs, a central hearth whose smoke rose into the rafters and drifted out through openings in the gable ends. He was raised on the move because West Saxon kings did not sit in one place. They travelled. They rode with their households and their warriors and their servants and their priests from one estate to another, eating through the food stored in each place, giving judgment, hearing complaints, receiving gifts, blessing churches, and riding on. This was called the itinerant household, and it was not a luxury. It was the only way a 9th century king could actually govern, because the kingdom had no real capital, no permanent bureaucracy, no machine that ran when the king was not in the room. Wherever the king was, that was the heart of Wessex for a few days or weeks, and then that heart moved. A boy born into that life knew movement before he knew anything else. He knew the smell of horses in the morning. He knew the creak of wagons loaded with chests. He knew the way a hall felt when hundreds of men were packed into it for a feast, and the way the same hall felt a day later when most of them had ridden out and only the low voices of a few servants remained by the fire. He knew rain on wool cloaks. He knew the weight of a child-sized mantle with a brooch at the shoulder. He knew what it was like to fall asleep in a strange place and wake up in another. But a youngest son, especially a small and often sickly one, did not ride in the centre of that procession. He rode somewhere near the back. He was handed to nurses. He was handed to monks. He was, quite simply, not at the centre of anyone's plan. And that mattered, because the way a prince was raised depended completely on the throne he was expected to inherit. The eldest son was trained for kingship from the moment he could walk. He was given weapons early. He was brought into councils. He was taught the faces of nobles, the boundaries of estates, the names of saints and enemies alike. The second son was trained as a kind of backup. The third, perhaps for the church or for rule over a lesser territory. By the time you reached the fifth son in a royal family, the expectations flattened. Such a boy was expected to be loyal, to be useful, to be well-behaved, and eventually to find his place as a noble servant of whichever of his brothers happened to be wearing the crown. So Alfred grew up in the shadow of a future that did not include him, and because no one was watching him very closely, something strange was able to happen. Something that would not have been allowed in a firstborn prince, something that in the end shaped him more than any military training ever could. He became, slowly, a different kind of boy. The story that has come down to us begins with his mother. Osburh, by the accounts later written by those who knew the court, was a woman of what contemporaries called noble mind, thoughtful, religious, attentive to her children in a way that was not universal among royal mothers of her age. And one day, so the story says, she sat her sons together in a chamber and she held up a book. The book itself is not described in detail. It was a book of Saxon poetry, written in the language the family actually spoke, a language we now call Old English. This was already unusual. In the 9th century, most serious books were in Latin, the language of the church and the educated. A book in the common tongue, illuminated and precious, was a rare and beautiful thing. And Osburh, with her sons gathered around her, made them an offer. The first of them who could learn the poems inside this book and recite them back to her would keep the book as his own. The older brothers looked at one another. They thought about it. They may have laughed. They may have shrugged. They were princes. They were warriors in training. Books were not the natural work of their hands. But Alfred, small and quiet and overlooked, looked at that book the way other boys in the hall looked at swords. Something in him woke up. The story says he took the book to a teacher. He listened, again and again, to the poems being read aloud. He did not yet read Latin fluently. He may not yet have read at all in the way we use the word. What he did instead was memorize. He pressed the rhythm of the lines into his mind until they lived there. And when he came back to his mother, he recited the poems, and the book was his. Now, we must be careful here. This story comes from a later biography, written by a man who loved Alfred and wanted the world to love him too. It has the shape of a moral tale. It may not be literally true in every detail. We do not know exactly which poems were in that book. We do not know whether the scene happened quite as described. What we can say, honestly, is this. The story was remembered, and it was remembered because it matched something real about the man Alfred became. A man who loved books in a world that largely did not. A man who, when he could have surrounded himself with warriors and horses and hunting dogs, asked instead for translators, teachers, scribes, and texts. A man who, as king, would later lament in his own voice that learning had almost vanished from England in his lifetime, and that he intended to bring it back. That obsession with words did not appear from nowhere when he took the crown. It began in a childhood that left him time to listen, time to memorize, time to fall in love with the sound of language before he fell in love with anything else. And it began, if the story is remembered correctly, with a mother who saw something in her youngest son that the rest of the court had not bothered to see. But the mother does not stay in the story long. Osber disappears from the records early, probably through death, although the sources do not say so plainly. And Alfred, still very young, would soon find himself on a journey that almost no English child of his age ever made, a journey that would take him across half of Europe, to the very centre of the Christian world, to Rome. It is difficult from our distance to feel how large Rome loomed in the imagination of a 9th century English boy. Rome was not a city in our sense. It was a memory, a promise, a legend that had not yet finished fading. The great empire was gone, centuries gone, its legions no more than rumours in the woods of Britain where their old roads still cut through the forests in straight, unnatural lines. But the church that had grown inside the empire remained. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, still spoke, still blessed, still crowned, still wrote. For a Christian king of Wessex, Rome was not a foreign capital. It was the spiritual heart of the world he believed in. And to send a son, there was not a diplomatic gesture. It was a devotion. Alfred travelled to Rome, according to the records, twice as a child. The first journey, likely when he was around 4 years old, was sent by his father in the company of noble attendants. The second, only a year or two later, was made in the company of his father himself, on a longer stay. Try to imagine that for a small boy. Try to imagine travelling in the 9th century from southern England to Rome. The boat crossing, the first glimpse of Frankish coast, the long ride through the kingdom of the Franks, which was in its own turmoil, its own internal wars, its own uneasy peace. The rivers crossed on flat barges, the nights spent in monasteries where lamps burned in the small hours and monks chanted psalms in the dark. The mountains, when you reached them, rising higher than any hill you had seen in England, their passes cold even in summer, their roads narrow, their silence enormous, and then, finally, the approach to Rome itself, the old walls, The ruined temples, the marble columns still standing, half buried, half reused in churches, the living city layered on the dead one, the smell of incense drifting from 100 churches at once, the crowds, the dialects, the pilgrims from every corner of Christendom, speaking tongues a Saxon boy had never heard, and in the middle of it all, at the great basilica of St. Peter, the Pope himself. The records say that on Alfred's first visit, Pope Leo IV anointed him, dressing him in a robe and giving him some kind of honour. Later accounts would read this as a prophetic royal anointing, as though the Pope had somehow seen the future king inside the small boy and consecrated him in advance. Historians today are much more cautious. Whatever happened in that ceremony, it was almost certainly not a coronation, nor a promise of kingship. It was more likely a kind of spiritual adoption, an honour given to the son of a friendly king. But what matters for our story is not the exact ritual. What matters is what the boy saw. He saw, at an age when most children have never travelled beyond the next village, an empire of faith. He saw buildings that had stood for 500 years before he was born. He saw scholars because Rome was still, despite all of its decay, a city of books. He saw art. He saw relics. He saw processions of clergy in robes more richly woven than anything in Wessex. He saw, in other words, a vision of what a Christian civilization could be when it remembered itself, and he carried that vision home. We cannot prove from the sources that those journeys changed him. No one, least of all a small boy, writes down what a journey has done to him in the moment. But we can look at the man he became later. We can look at his obsession with learning, his fierce belief that kings had a duty to be educated and to educate, his gathering as a grown man of scholars from Wales, from Mercia, from the continent, to help rebuild a culture he believed had been half destroyed. We can look at his own translations later in life of works he considered the most necessary books for the English mind. That did not come from a single childhood trip, but it also did not come from nowhere. It came in part from the memory of a boy who had once stood in Rome and had seen what a civilization that still believed in writing looked like. When he returned to Wessex, he was still a younger son, still not expected to rule, still in many ways a quiet figure at the edge of the family, but something in him had sharpened. The world he came back to, though, was not the world he had left. The Vikings had come. They had been coming, in truth, since before Alfred was born. As early as the last years of the 8th century, ships out of Scandinavia had been landing on English coasts, burning monasteries, carrying off gold, slaves, and lives. At first they came as raiders. They came, struck, and left. A monastery, a stretch of coast, a single undefended town. The damage was savage but local. People prayed, people rebuilt. People whispered that perhaps the end of days had come, because what else could bring such heathens across the sea? But by the time Alfred was a young boy, the raiders had begun to stay. Small camps became larger camps. Summer raids became winter quarters. The men from the north began to bring families, then armies, then, eventually, kings of their own, sailing down rivers that had always belonged to the Saxons, riding inland with horses taken from Saxon stables, occupying halls that had once welcomed Saxon kings. In the year 865, when Alfred was perhaps 16 years old, a force so large it was remembered as the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia. It did not come to raid, it came to conquer. Within a few years, one English kingdom after another fell. Northumbria collapsed into defeat. East Anglia's King Edmund was killed, and his kingdom with him. Mercia began to crumble. By the early 870s, Wessex, the southern kingdom where Alfred had been born, was effectively the last great English kingdom still standing, the last flame of Saxon rule in a land that had been Saxon for centuries. And in that slow, terrible tightening of pressure, Alfred's own family was being rewritten, one death at a time. His father, Ethelwulf, had returned from his own pilgrimage to Rome, remarried a very young Frankish princess named Judith, and died not long after, in 858. The crown passed first to Ethelbald, the eldest surviving son, and then, after Ethelbald died only 2 years later, to Ethelbert. Ethelbert ruled for a handful of years. He too died relatively young in 865. The crown passed again, this time to Ethelred, the fourth brother, who was now King of Wessex, at exactly the moment the great heathen army arrived in England. Do you see what is happening inside this family? One by one, the older brothers Alfred had grown up behind were stepping onto the throne, and one by one, they were dying. Not in battle yet, not in glory yet, simply dying as men did in the 9th century, of illness, of exhaustion, of the ordinary and endless dangers of a world without medicine. And as each brother died, the unlikely prince, the smallest, the fifth, the one who had been raised with almost no expectation that he would ever rule, moved one quiet step closer to the crown. He did not move toward it by ambition. There is no sign in anything the sources tell us that Alfred schemed for the throne. There is no sign that he hated his brothers or envied them or plotted around them. By every account we have, he was loyal, deeply, almost painfully so. He rode with them, fought with them, counseled them, supported their kings and their causes. He seems to have understood in some quiet part of himself that the world had given him time his brothers did not have, time to read, time to travel, time to think, and he used it. By the time he was a young man, probably in his late teens or early 20s, the sources begin to speak of him as the second man, a designated heir, a deputy under his older brother. When Ethelred became king, Alfred stood just beside him, close enough that the court and the kingdom knew where to look if Ethelred fell. And the court and the kingdom did look, because Ethelred was under more pressure than perhaps any West Saxon king before him. The Vikings, who had devoured the other kingdoms, had turned toward Wessex. The great heathen army, now reinforced, now hardened, now led by war leaders whose names still echo in Norse memory, rode down onto the old borders of the West Saxons in the winter of 870 and 871. Alfred rode beside his brother into that storm, and it is in this moment, not yet king, not yet famous, not yet anything a chronicler would bother to describe in detail, that we finally see what the quiet, younger son had become. He was not, by all accounts, a man built for war in the old heroic sense. He did not have the towering frame. He did not have the legendary strength. The sources say he had been plagued throughout his life by a mysterious illness, an affliction that visited him in spasms of pain, sometimes incapacitating, and that he himself seems to have understood as a kind of burden laid on him by God. Whether the illness was what we today might call Crohn's disease or something else entirely, we cannot say, but it was real. And it meant that every campaign, every ride, every battle, every cold night in a camp on the frozen ground was fought not only against the enemy outside him, but also against the enemy inside him. And yet he rode, he fought, he counselled, he prayed. In the winter of 871, a series of battles was fought across the chalk hills of Berkshire and Wiltshire, a winter campaign that is still remembered by historians as one of the hardest years any English king ever lived through. At a place called Ashdown, Alfred commanded one wing of the army while his brother Ethelred commanded the other. The story, as it was later told, says that when the moment of battle came, Ethelred was still in his tent, hearing Mass, refusing to leave until the service was finished. Alfred, seeing the enemy already advancing, did not wait. He launched his wing of the army forward, leading the charge himself like a wild boar, as the later account put it. The West Saxons won that day, one victory in a war of many battles. The sources list a string of them in that year alone, reading, basing. Meriton, some won, some lost, each one brutal, each one costing men, each one slowly grinding down the body and the spirit of a young king who was already wearing out. And then, in the spring of 871, Ethelred died. The sources do not tell us exactly how. They say only that he was laid to rest at a place called Wimborne in Dorset. Whether his death came from a wound, from illness, from exhaustion, from the accumulated weight of a reign spent entirely at war, we cannot know. What we do know is that when he died, he left behind young sons, very young, too young in the judgment of the council that ruled such things, to wear a crown in the middle of a Viking war, and so the choice fell, as it had to fall, on the last surviving brother, on Alfred, the small boy who had stood in the doorway, the youngest of 5, the unlikely prince, the child who had been sent to Rome, the teenager who had loved his mother's book, the younger brother who had ridden behind 4 older brothers, and then 3, and then 2, and then 1. The man who had just watched his last brother die. He was somewhere around 22 years old. He had been married, for only a few years, to a Mercian noblewoman named Ealhswith, whose family would tie him to the struggling kingdom to the north of Wessex. They had begun to have children of their own. He had fought, by that point, in more battles than most men his age could have imagined. He had seen friends fall. He had seen hearths grow silent. He had seen villages burned. He had seen churches emptied. And now, while the Viking army was still in the field, while Wessex still bled, while the outcome of the war was not only uncertain, but, in the eyes of most observers at the time, leaning the wrong way, he was asked to take the crown of a kingdom that might not survive his reign. He did not, as far as we can tell, want it. Later writings attributed to him suggest that he took the throne with something close to dread, that he understood, better than almost anyone, how much was being asked of him. He had not been raised to be king. He had been raised to be the youngest son of a king. He had spent his life watching men more prepared than he was ascend to the throne and be broken by it. Now the weight was his. And here, at the threshold, we finally reach the thing that makes his story strange. Because if you believed, as most of the nobles in that hall at Wimborne must have believed, that kingship required grooming, training, lineage of expectation, the battle hardening of a firstborn son, then Alfred was the worst candidate any council could have chosen. He was the youngest. He was often ill. He had spent much of his childhood reading rather than riding. He was, on paper, unprepared. But if you believed that a king in that moment, in that war, in that terrible winter of a century that seemed intent on breaking England altogether, needed something different, then Alfred was suddenly, almost miraculously, the right man. Because all the things that had seemed in his childhood like signs that he would never rule had been quietly preparing him to rule well. The quietness that had kept him at the edge of the family had given him the habit of listening. The illness that had plagued him had given him the habit of suffering without breaking. The mother who had put a book of poems into his hands had given him a love of words in a world that was forgetting them. The trips to Rome had given him a vision of civilization beyond the borders of Wessex, a sense that there were old and great things worth preserving. The long years as a younger brother had given him patience. The role as second man of the kingdom had given him experience. The death of his brothers had given him, at a terrible price, a clear view of what the crown actually cost. And the Viking Age, the thing that had seemed for his entire life like a darkening sky on the horizon, had given him something else that few men in his position ever had. It had given him no illusions. He knew, when he stepped forward to take the crown, exactly what he was stepping into. He had seen it, he had ridden through it, he had buried brothers in it. He was not walking into the idea of kingship. He was walking into its actual weight, with his eyes open, in the middle of a war, without any real confidence that he would live long enough to finish what he was beginning. That is not the posture of a legend. Not yet. Legends are something that history, much later, drapes over men who survive long enough to be remembered. In the spring of 871, Alfred was not yet that. He was a young man in a wooden hall somewhere in southern England, with grief still fresh in his face, with a young wife beside him, with the news of his brother's death barely cold, being asked to take a crown that many in the room must have feared would not outlast the year. He accepted it. The chroniclers do not tell us how he looked when he did. They do not tell us what he said, if he said anything at all, beyond the ritual words that such a moment required. They do not tell us whether his hand trembled when it reached for the thin circlet of gold or the sword, or whatever sign of kingship was offered. They tell us only the fact, quietly, the way they tell us most facts of that age, that in 871, after the death of his brother Ethelred, Alfred became king of the West Saxons. That is where our story ends. Not at the legend, not at the victory, not at the moment the name the Great would be added, long after his own life, by later generations who needed a hero and found one in him. Our story ends in the ordinary stillness of a young man who had just been handed something he had spent his entire life being told he would never have: the crown of Wessex. And it ends, as it began, with the quiet fact that almost everything about his earlier life had seemed, on the surface, to be the wrong preparation for this moment. The small body, the books, the silence, the distance from the centre of the hall, the long line of older brothers, the uncertainty, the illness, the grief, and yet, standing there, in the last light of a kingdom that still did not know whether it would survive the year, Alfred was, in some hidden way, ready. Not because he had been groomed for power, but because he had been shaped, patiently, by a life that nobody had thought important enough to stage manage. A life of listening instead of speaking, of watching instead of leading, of learning instead of commanding. A life in which no one had prepared him to rule, and so nothing false had been layered onto him. When the moment came, the man who stepped forward was, improbably, exactly who the kingdom needed. A younger son, a quiet reader, a traveller, a brother who had buried his brothers, a husband, a believer, a man whose whole childhood, whose whole youth, whose whole quiet and overlooked early life had been leading, without his knowledge and without anyone else's, to one cold spring in 871, when he lifted his head in a hall full of grieving, frightened men and accepted the crown of Wessex. The boy in the doorway was gone. The king had arrived, and although no one in that hall could have known it, not the nobles, not the bishops, not the weary warriors, not even Alfred himself, the life he had lived until that moment, the long, quiet, unlikely life that almost nobody had bothered to watch, had just become the foundation of everything England was about to become.